In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history. Ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they saw a need to protect over all others. Some are big. Some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. In Legacy of the Great Plains, we will visit the 10 monuments associated with America's once vast grasslands.
The northern Great Plains stretch from Minnesota in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west. During the 19th century, this vast land of prairie grass and buffalo was the domain of the Sioux Indian Nation, a nation that would be at the heart of the Plains Indian Wars. I'm Bo Svensson, and I will take you to the national monuments that tell the story of these proud Native Americans and their conflicts with the U.S. cavalry. Pipestone National Monument is perhaps the most important spot on the Great Plains for Native American people. It contains the source rock from which the sacred peace pipes were and still are carved. After the Indian Wars ended in 1890, an unknowing and uncaring public exploited the pipestone quarries until the monument designation returned them to America's native peoples.
In the far southwestern corner of Minnesota is Pipestone National Monument. Surrounded by picture postcard farms of the nation's heartland, Pipestone is a 1.5 billion-year-old geologic island of Sioux quartzite. Designated a monument in 1937 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the park preserves the most dramatic example of the ancient sands that would become the hard red quartzite. Rushing through the park is Pipestone Creek, tumbling and raging until it suddenly crashes over when Owissa falls. Along the banks, a baby duckling looks for its mother. Further downstream, the prehistoric snapping turtle finds his favorite resting spot. A plaque commemorates the Nicollet Fremont expedition of 1838, an expedition that told the story of this remarkable spot. It was also the first expedition of America's legendary Western explorer, John C. Fremont. Nearby, hanging from branches, Native American prayer cloths and medicine bundles tell us this place is sacred land. Indeed, it is sacred land to all of America's Native people. It is here that for centuries Native peoples have come to quarry special layers of a soft red rock tucked in among the quartzites. It is from this famous layer, the Pipestone layer, that the spectacularly carved sacred pipes of the Plains Indians' warriors were cut. Today, America's Native peoples, and only America's Native peoples, can still quarry the sacred red rock in the series of new and old quarries that bisect the monument from north to south. Inside the visitor center at Pipestone National Monument is one of the finest collections of pipestone carvings and artifacts in the nation. It's such a wonder. A rock that is so soft that it can be carved by a knife or scratched by a fingernail. How did such a rock come to be? Most of the rock exposed at Pipestone National Monument is the super hard Sioux quartzite. Harder than granite, even harder than steel. Like all quartzites, the Sioux quartzite found within the monument was once ancient sand grains. Sand grains that were laid down layer by layer on the floor bed of a 1.7 billion-year-old Precambrian sea. Over time, more and more sediments covered the sand layers, so that finally, by intense heat and pressure, a geological process called metamorphosis, the sand grains were fused together into the spectacular formation of reddish-pink Sioux quartzite found here today along Pipestone Creek. This is the standard geological story. But here at Pipestone National Monument, something unique happened. From time to time, 1.7 billion years ago, mud layers became sandwiched between the sand layers. Mud layers that metamorphized not into quartzite, but a mudstone called Catlinite. Named after the famous Western painter George Catlin, who popularized the pipestone quarries, it is these highly prized mudstone layers that were used to produce the intricate calumets, the peace pipes of Hiawatha legend. 5 distinct layers of catlinite are exposed in a series of north-south pipestone quarries that run for 2/3 of a mile within the monument's boundaries. For millions of years, the rock at Pipestone lay hidden deep in the earth. Instrumental in exposing the quartzite bedrock at Pipestone were the glaciers that moved down from the north during the ice ages of the Pleistocene epoch. Evidence of those glaciers is present throughout the monument.
The incised or scratched-looking lines upon the face of this rock are believed to be examples of glacial striae or striations that were left here when the last glacial period occurred in our area about 10,000 years ago. You can imagine a sheet of ice about a mile thick above this area, pressing down upon our bedrock and everything over it. As that happened, it left these marks looking like almost like a giant refrigerator has been moved across the floor and leaving, large, long scratches as it went.
After the glaciers retreated, the land bounded by Pipestone National Monument found itself on the eastern edge of the Great Plains, part of the vast prairie ecosystem of tall grasses and buffalo. The area's historic name is Couteau de Prairie, the highland of prairie. The small prairie remnant preserved within the monument is one of the best examples of this nearly extinct ecosystem, an ecosystem that produced the fertile soils that now make up America's breadbasket. The human history of the monument centers on the Pipestone quarries. Nearly 3,000 years ago, native people began picking up pieces of soft pipestone rock, which they carved and traded. Then between 700 to 1200 AD, the Indians who belonged to a great mound-building culture came to the site and quarried the soft pipestone rock. Their pipestone artifacts have been found throughout their empire from Ohio to Texas. When French trappers arrived in the area in the 18th century, the quarries were controlled by a branch of the Sioux Indian Nation, the Yankton Sioux. Later, the magical soft red rock was known to Lewis and Clark. However, its source was cloaked in mystery. Then in 1831, the quarries were discovered by frontiersman Philander Prescott. But it was George Catlin, America's most famous Western and Indian painter, who put the Pipestone quarries on the map. Just beginning his career, he visited the quarries, and in 1836, he painted and brought back stories of the noble Indians, diligently producing the sacred peace pipes. He retold the Sioux legend of the pipestone's origins. At an ancient time, the Great Spirit stood upon the wall of rock and called all the tribes around him, and breaking out a piece of the red stone, formed it into a pipe and smoked it, the smoke rolling over the whole multitude. He then told his red children that this red stone was their flesh, and that they were made from it, and that they must all smoke to him through it, and that they must use it for nothing but pipes. And as it belonged alike to all tribes, the ground was sacred, and no weapons must be used or brought upon it. So inspired by Catlin's romantic account of the noble Indians, poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow penned the Song of Hiawatha in 1855. On the mountains of the prairie, on the great red pipestone quarry, Gitche Manitou the mighty, he the master of life descending, from the red stone of the quarry, with his hand he broke a fragment, molded it into a pipe head, shaped and fashioned it with figures. Gitche Manitou the mighty smoked the calumet, the peace pipe. However, the idealized peace portrayed by Catlin and Longfellow was short-lived. In 1858, the Yankton Sioux left the area while retaining a claim on the quarries. Then in 1862, the region became inflamed in war. What became known as the Sioux Uprising found the Santee Sioux attacking settlers, towns, and forts throughout southwestern Minnesota. In 6 weeks, over 600 whites and hundreds of Indians were dead. All-out war between the Sioux Nation and the United States military would not end for another 28 years. During this time, American settlement threatened to consume the square-mile Yankton Sioux claim. Outsiders were digging new pits and extracting the sacred stone. In 1928, the Yanktons, now resettled on a reservation 150 miles away, sold their claim to the federal government. Pipestone National Monument was signed into existence in 1937 and opened to the public with quarrying limited to Indians.
To become a quarrier here, there are several steps that need to be done to ensure that only the people that can remove the stone here are Native American. Have to require that people who quarry carry a federally recognized tribal identity card, and upon application to quarry, they have to show that card as part of the application process. There are only about 64 quarry pits along the way. Each pit is about 15 feet square and about 10 feet deep. And to have access to one of those pits, many times there's a year or two waiting list. A lot of these pits are run by the same family or individual for years and years and years. And if for whatever reason those individuals decide not to quarry over a year's time, the pit becomes available to the next person on the list.
Today, the monument is once again sacred Indian land.
If the Indian Wars effectively started with the Minnesota Massacre near Pipestone National Monument, they effectively ended with the Sioux Nation's greatest military victory over the United States 7th Cavalry, led by Colonel George Armstrong Custer, along the Little Bighorn River. Here is the only battlefield site in the National Monument System. It's a site supercharged with meaning for both sides. It's the Little Bighorn Battle Site National Monument. For many years, the site only presented the U.S. military tragedy. Today, it's a memorial to both sides of the conflict.
On the gently rolling hills that make up the river valley of the Little Bighorn River in southern Montana, on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the nation, the unthinkable happened. An event would turn this peaceful hillside into hallowed ground, like the Alamo, Gettysburg, Pearl Harbor, and 9/11's Ground Zero. This is the battle site where on June 25, 1876, America's great Civil War hero, General George Armstrong Custer, and 210 men of the 7th Cavalry, as well as 60 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, lost their lives. The Little Bighorn National Monument got its designation in 1946 by President Harry Truman. There is a national cemetery here, a smaller version of the Arlington National Cemetery just outside of the nation's capital. Many of the survivors from the larger battle on that fateful day, such as Major Reno, the 7th Cavalry's Crow Scouts and soldiers, are buried here. Then there is Last Stand Hill. Here, simple obelisks mark where the bodies of the fallen soldiers, including Custer, were found 4 days after the battle. Except for the officers, Last Stand Hill is also a mass grave for those same soldiers. But it's what's not here, at least not visible, that draws people to the monument. It is the mystery surrounding what happened on that fateful day. The voices of the dead soldiers and warriors call out here. Here, a connection to something larger than life can be felt. The battle site of the Little Bighorn is on the western edge of the Great Plains. The area is part of the Yellowstone River drainage basin, an arid region of short-grass prairie covering gently rolling hills. When the nomadic warrior tribes moved onto the Great Plains at the end of the 17th century, they found huge herds of buffalo, the total number estimated to be over 60 million animals. These woolly mammals, weighing up to 2,000 pounds, were constantly on the move from area to area. The Indians also found a very peculiar mammal, the pronghorn. The fastest-hooved animal in the Western Hemisphere, the pronghorn resembled the impala antelope of Africa. To a lesser degree, there were also elk, the second largest member of the deer family, and 2 species of deer, the larger mule deer on the western side of the prairies, and the more skittish and smaller white-tailed deer on the eastern prairies. All of these herd animals played a role in the rise of the nomadic horse cultures by providing food and materials for shelter and clothing. Today, all of these animals are making a comeback and can be seen on the western Great Plains. That fateful battle that occurred on June 25, 1876, was the culmination of 23 years of fierce conflict between the 5 warrior tribes of the Great Plains and the United States Cavalry, whose job was to protect the ever-growing numbers of miners, settlers, and immigrants crossing the Great Plains. In 1680, Spanish colonists were forced to abandon their ranches and farms in present-day New Mexico, leaving most of their horse stock behind. Within a mere 50 years, 5 secondary tribes, the Sioux, Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Cheyenne, living along the edge of the Great Plains, transformed themselves into a remarkable nomadic warrior culture. Using those Spanish horses, metal-tipped arrows, and later guns, these Native Americans moved out onto the prairies, and by the 19th century had settled into relatively stable territories. Using the buffalo as the primary food source, these tribes had grown and flourished into economic powerhouses. Then, in 1804, President Thomas Jefferson purchased what was essentially the Great Plains from the French in what is known as Louisiana Purchase. Americans soon wanted this land for themselves, and this meant removing the warrior tribes from the Great Plains. But this proved to be a long and violent process. The nomadic tribes fought a highly successful guerrilla-style war and were nearly impossible to catch. In the Minnesota Uprising of 1862, over 600 white settlers were killed by the Santee Sioux. That was followed in 1864 by the brutal Cheyenne attacks on the Oregon Trail in eastern Nebraska. From that point on, it would be a bitter fight to the end. Major atrocities occurred on both sides. The Sand Creek Massacre. In November 1864, Colonel John Shivington and the Colorado militia ambushed Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek, killing more than 100 Indians, mostly women and children. The Cheyenne Winter Offensive of 1865. Cheyenne warriors shut down the Oregon Trail, attacking stations and ranches along the Platte River, leaving few, if any, survivors. The Fetterman Massacre. In December 1866, outside of Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming, Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, including Crazy Horse, massacred 81 cavalrymen led by Captain William Fetterman. Washita. In 1868, Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry attacked Black Kettle's camp in Oklahoma, killing Black Kettle and 103 Indians, mostly women and children. And Summit Springs. In 1869, U.S. cavalry surprised Cheyenne Chief Tall Bull's village and killed more than 50 Indians. By the time of the Battle of Washita in 1868, the U.S. cavalry had turned its full attention to the Plains Indian problem. Civil War heroes and leaders Sherman, Sheridan, and Custer were now leading a campaign of total destruction to force the nomadic tribes into sedentary lifestyles on restricted reservations. Indeed, by 1876, most of the native peoples of the plains had been relocated on reservations. But the old ways died slowly. In the summers, many warriors would return to the plains, hunting buffalo and raiding settlers once again. Such was the case with the Sioux and Cheyenne in 1876. Led by great war chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, they had gathered for their annual Sundance along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in southern Montana. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, General George Crook, and Colonel John Gibbon, each leading separate columns of troopers, had been given the assignment to find these renegade Sioux and Cheyenne warriors and force them back onto the reservations. But it was Custer's 12 companies of 700 men that made up the 7th Cavalry that found Sitting Bull in the mile-long Sioux and Cheyenne village, a village that contained over 2,000 warriors. Custer hoped to surprise the village.
However, the surprise came on him, for he met his defeat there. Dividing his companies into 4 battalions, Company B was with the pack train and about 200 men, and 3 other companies were with Captain Benteen, and another 3 companies were with Major Reno, and Custer himself commanding 5 companies comprising 2 battalions. Then the 7th Cavalry advanced onto the village. Reno, with his 3 companies, first came into the valley, and they were quickly surrounded, and in a matter of minutes he withdrew and retreated about a mile towards the Little Bighorn River and then up the bluffs up on top, not far from here. And there he was under siege for 2 days, losing more than 50 men, most of them on that retreat from the valley. Captain Benteen's 3 companies soon joined him up there.
The unanswered question is, why Benteen joined Reno rather than following orders to bring the ammunition and link up with Custer as he and his men advanced on the village? What was Custer's plan?
His motive that day of the fight, why would 220 men attack a village 3.5 miles long with at least 2,000 armed warriors? Well, it wasn't to fight the Indians as much as it was to capture the women and children and use them as human shields to then negotiate a surrender of the Indians to the reservations. So it was really to prevent a fight that he wanted to get into the village. The surprise to Custer was that he didn't surprise the village. When he came upon the village at Medicine Tail Coulee, the women and children were already a good mile or two fleeing in the opposite direction.
When his strategy failed, Custer divided his companies to wait for Benteen. But when Benteen failed to appear, Custer and his men were overwhelmed and wiped out to the last man. This was the Plains Indians' greatest military victory, but it also hardened the resolve of Eastern politicians to end the nomadic warrior cultures once and for all. Today, exactly what happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn is hotly debated. But what is not debated is that this is one of the nation's most hallowed grounds.
Thanks for watching America's National Monuments, Legacy of the Great Plains, and reliving with me America's longest war, the battle between the U.S. cavalry and the Sioux Nation for control of the northern Great Plains. I'm Bo Svensson.